Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I am Lilia Mooney, Executive Director of CAROLA, the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas. I'm also an adjunct professor of Business, Human Rights, and Sustainability at the Georgetown Law Center. Welcome to the fifth module of our fall series called The Americas in Times of COVID-19. The goal of this fall series is to bring together members of our Georgetown community, professors, students, alumni, together with leaders and professionals to discuss some of the most pressing issues in the Americas by offering a diverse perspectives on law, regulation, and policy alternatives. Our session today is on business, human rights, and sustainability in the Americas. For the past 9 years, this is a time when many of us, I include myself as well, are getting ready to travel to Geneva to attend the annual Forum on Business and Human Rights that is scheduled actually to happen remotely next week, given the current conditions we're living in. That is why it's such a treat to have the opportunity to reflect on what is next for this big business, human rights, and sustainability in the agenda, particularly in the Latin American context. Where are we? Where are we going? How might a roadmap for the next decade look like? We know that the conversation around business and society does not happen in a vacuum. It is multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary, context-driven, human-centered, and has direct impacts on the environment. And these decisions, this activity has an impact on us today, but it also will have an impact on those generations that will come after us. The Sustainable Development Goals, the big goals, provide a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all of us. In particular, Sustainable Development Goal 17 is worth noticing here, and it reminds us of the importance of partnership frameworks as a gateway for bringing together different stakeholders that are called to advance the Sustainable Development Agenda. We also know that this conversation and practice can advance within solid governance and rule of law frameworks that create the conditions for the relationship between business and society to operate within clear rules of the game and through a leveling of the playing field for everyone to prosper and advance in societies. Some brief data points here that are worth noting. According to the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index, the rule of law is declining around the world for the third year in a row in areas of fundamental rights, constraint on government powers, and absence of corruption, among other topics. Here, it's also relevant to bring in Sustainable Development Goal 16, because it speaks for this by providing a framework for peace, justice, and strong institutions to access justice for all, using UNGP guidelines, the UNGP language, how do we access remedy for those individuals and communities affected by different types of activity, and by building effective, accountable institutions at all levels. Today, in this multi-stakeholder dialogue, we want to explore what the future may hold for the business, human rights, and sustainability agenda in light of the COVID crisis around the world. Momentum behind the implementation of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence requirements continue to grow. And examples, the most recent ones of these include the potential European Union directive on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, and the ongoing discussions and negotiations around the UN Treaty on Business and Human Rights, which, by the way, just concluded its 6 rounds of negotiations. We also know that the COVID-19 pandemic has centered attention on human rights challenges for companies' own operations and value chains, while also putting a lot of stress on how governments are able to respond to this public health crisis. In these extraordinary times, how can governments effectively deliver on the duty to protect human rights? How can the private sector integrate human rights due diligence as part of sustainable development practices, sustained development practices that respect and deliver tangible results for affected communities and individuals. And to what extent are trade agreements and mandatory human rights due diligence requirements driving institutional change, investors' advocacy, corporate governance reform at the national, international, and regional levels that provide effective remedies for affected communities and individuals. To address some of these questions, these are big questions, we have a stellar panel of speakers joining us today. They work at the international, regional, and national levels. And I will do my best to highlight their bios with the understanding that I will not be able to do justice to their long list of accomplishments. I will introduce them in the order that they will speak. Mr. Dante Pesce is, since July 1st this year, if I am saying this correctly, Dante is the Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. He is the founder and executive director of the Vincular Center for Social Responsibility and Sustainable Development at the Catholic University of Paraíso, Chile, where he works on 14 Latin American countries through outreach, building capacity, and providing advisory services related to sustainability and responsible business practices, including business and human rights, sustainability reporting, corporate sustainability, and many other issues related to this work. On a personal note, I think it's very important to say that how grateful I am, and we all are, for his service as a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, representing Latin America. I've seen his devotion, his commitment over the years, engaging with all sectors and making sure that all of our voices are heard in this process. Following, we have Dr. Olga Orozco, who is an agricultural engineer with a master's in ethnobotany and PhD in botany from the City University of New York. Her 25 years of professional experience are centered in the application of codes of conduct, social and environmental certifications in international supply chains for agricultural products, manufacturing, and electronics. She has been the Director of Operations at the Business Social Compliance Initiative of the European Foreign Trade Association, and also Director of Operations of the US-based auditing company, ALGI. Since 2015, she works at the International Labour Organization, presently as a Chief Technical Advisor for the Responsible Business Conduct Project in Latin America and the Caribbean. Following, we'll have Dr. Amanda Romero Medina, who has been a human rights activist and educator since the late 70s in Colombia and Latin America. Since 2011, she has been a senior researcher and is currently the regional representative for South America of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, an NGO based in London, New York, Berlin, and Bogota. She's based in Bogota, where she's the legal representative of the Resource Center's Colombia program and for Latin America. Amanda has a PhD in education by the Universidad Pedagógica Nacional, and she has been at the forefront of human rights initiatives in Colombia and the rest of Latin America. Following, we'll have José Augusto Palma, who currently serves as the Vice President of the Association of the Mining, Petroleum, and Electricity Industries of Peru, where he also presides over the mining chapter. The association plays an active role in public policy discussions involving the mining sector, as well as promoting best practices in the industry, including in the areas of sustainability and human rights. Mr. Palma works for Hochschild Mining, where he's the Vice President of Legal and Corporate Affairs. Hochschild is a precious metals mining company listed on the London Stock Exchange with mining operations and projects in Peru, Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. Prior to joining Hochschild, José has successfully led a 13-year legal career in the United States, where was a partner at Switzerland Berlin, and following which he worked at the World Bank. He also served in the government of Peru for 2 years. And José is a proud Hoya, He holds an LLM from the Georgetown University Law Center. And he is also a member of the Latin American Law Board of the Georgetown Law Center, who responded so enthusiastically about the invitation to participate in this discussion from the very beginning. Thank you for your service to our beloved Georgetown Law Center, José Augusto. And lastly, but not least important, we have Andrea Pradilla Andrade, who is also another Georgetown graduate, I should say. Since 2014, Andrea is the director of the Global Reporting Initiative in charge of the Latin American portfolio from Bogota, Colombia, where she leads corporate sustainability and sustainable development strategies. Andrea is also a professor of corporate sustainability at the CESA School of Business. And before joining GRI, Andrea led the national team at the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Tourism in Colombia, creating and implementing the program tools to comply with the OECD strategic policy guidelines. And she also led the inclusion of sustainable development aspects in the Colombian trade negotiations and co-authored the first draft of the national guidelines for promoting corporate sustainability. Andrea received her bachelor's degree in law from the great Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Colombia, and also holds a master's degree with honors in international relations and international development from Georgetown University, where she has also obtained a specialization with honors in international business diplomacy. As you can see, there is a lot of talent, experience in this webinar. We will run this session as part of a dialogue where our speakers will make a series of presentations, and it's going to be a conversation. After we have completed this first hour, we will open up for questions, comments from the audience via the Q&A section on Zoom. So I will invite everyone in the audience to post their comments and address them to any particular speaker, if you will. So without further ado, let's dive into this discussion. You bring so much wealth of expertise, talent, combining academic work, activist work, leading regional and international organizations in the private sector, civil society, and working in this mix of international law, regional law, national law, and organizations that are leading these processes. Could you tell us a bit more about your work? And what are the most pressing issues that you are currently working on to advance this conversation as we think a roadmap for the business, human rights, and sustainability agenda? Dante, please do take it away.
My intervention well. I had a small signal and the monitor that said
Dante? All right, we're gonna have to get him back online.
Okay. So should we move with Olga in the
Can you
meantime?
hear me now?
Oh, okay, yes, we can hear you well, Dante.
Okay, now you can hear me well. I changed. I changed my device, so I hope you can hear me better now. Is that okay? Good. Okay, so my computer failed, but my phone is working. It's kind of strange, but at least it's working. So thank you very much. Okay, I just want to make a few reflections because I know we don't have a lot of time, and then let's say after listening to all my co-panelists, we can have an interactive dialogue. So that would be the ideal world. So first of all, we are reaching the 10th anniversary of the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, a landmark, 10 years from a consensus reached out by all governments, so unanimity in 2011, to adopt and to recognize these principles by an intergovernmental body, the Human Rights Council, and then supported by business, civil society, unions, indigenous, etc., as a blueprint for how to address, let's say, human rights impacts and how to reconciliate business activities and their impacts with the respect for human rights. So that's, let's say, first point. We're in the 5th year of the Regional Forum on Business and Human Rights. Actually, Olga has participated, Andrea participated in the first one of them, and we are in the 5th Regional Forum on Business and Human Rights a few weeks ago in September, promoting a race to the top regionally. And we had 4,300 participants and 43 sessions, 14 governments speaking, ministers and vice minister level, and all industry associations, the chambers of commerce to the employers associations, unions, indigenous, etc., participating. So we are creating a platform that puts the focus on implementation. But first of all, we needed to create a platform for dialogue, because in our region, we're not used to dialogue. So that's the second point that I would like to stress, that we're putting together a platform for exchange, for learning, for improving, and not to finger point each other. Of course, there are legacy. Of course, there's a lot of remedy that has not been provided. We have shortcomings all over our region, but nevertheless, we're being able to work collaboratively with ILO, with OECD, now more recently with UNDP, with ECLAC, with the OES. So we're putting together a regional platform to stimulate a race to the top and improve over time. And we are 2 years into a regional project funded by the EU and co-implemented with ILO and OECD. And of course, Olga is is the head of ILO regarding that project. I will not go into a lot of details about it, just to say that 10 years, the guiding principles, 5 years, the race to the top in the region with a forum, in 2 years, a project that is pushing practical implementation, peer learning exercise, peer pressure, learning lessons, collaboration in practice, etc. So that's, let's say, the first point that I wanted to make. The second point is the overall entry point that we have as a working group regarding the practical agenda on implementing the guiding principles is goal 17 of the SDGs. So a renewed alliance for sustainable development, collaboration, multi-stakeholder approach, looking after solutions based in participation, with all voices on the table, critical voices on the table, unheard voices on the table, and basically have a level playing field and try to have a level playing field in terms of stakeholders that have an unbalanced power. And therefore, we're looking after solutions based on participation among equals. And that is a struggle in itself, let's say a challenge in itself. But we're trying to do that. And the second goal after 17, collaboration, is what you just mentioned already, Leila, which is the goal 16, peace, justice, and solid institutions. And because the solutions that we need to build have to be built on top of foundations that are institutions. And if our institutions are weak, our solutions are weak. And we can have a nice and good looking design, but a design of a solution that is on top of weak foundations is unlikely to work and unlikely to last, unlikely to be embedded. And therefore, we have a priority in institutional building and institutional strengthening. And that is, of course, a challenge that we face big time. The third element that I want to mention are the drivers for the business and human rights agenda. And we have good news on this regard. One, expectations, societal expectations regarding the role of business and society and the respect for human rights are on the rise, are growing. And of course, in certain jurisdictions are growing faster and are more mature and more, let's say, well-established. But in all jurisdictions in the world and in our region, it is expanding the societal expectations, business to respect human rights as part of their competitiveness strategy or the overall sustainability strategy. So that's one thing, which is important because it's being said, it's being captured, it's more clear every day, and we have a lot of indications that that is the case. The second is regulation. And we're seeing a regulatory wave, especially in the context of Western Europe, around the Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative, around mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, about the updated version of the European Directive on Transparency and Accountability, the environmental taxonomy is kicking in early next month, and we're discussing with the Commission about expanding it into social impacts. Do the COVID-19 outcomes or the pandemic reality that is raising, let's say, the priority giving to social impacts and human rights impacts in particular. So that's, let's say, the regulatory wave is coming. The private sector is capturing that and is speaking publicly and loudly. More than 2,500 companies in Europe supporting the legislative push for a level playing field regarding due diligence. So that's great news, let's say. Third is the business to business push. And that is something that is very tangible in Latin America. So companies are asking their distributors and their suppliers and contractors about practices, let's say very practical ones on good governance around corruption and integrity, but also good practices regarding health and safety at the operational level, and more, let's say, around impacts and how my clients or suppliers are dealing preventatively with impacts. And that is something that most part of exported-oriented industries feel on a daily basis, big, small companies also. So that is actually happening, the business-to-business relation. And we still have a lot of gaps there, of course. We don't want to let's say, well, I have to park there because I can go on this element. The SME is part of it. The informal economy is part of it. So we have a lot of missing elements, but at least we're in good track in regarding business to business. The state as an economic actor, for example, on the public procurement arena, again, it's a business to business relation, but we see traction, we see progress, we see lessons being learned, and we see a multiplication of efforts on this in this level. And finally, and the most promising area are the investors. And the investors do regulation also on fiduciary duty that is going to change in Europe. For example, making board members accountable to their decisions that should shift the set of incentives from very short term to at least medium term. But that the investors are really pushing the agenda a lot in practice. The Principles for Responsible Investment of the UN launch a roadmap for business and human rights to be respected by investors, both at in-home policies, but also in the lending and investors criteria and policies. Today, less than 5% of the signatories of the PRI have a policy regarding business and human rights, and their goal that was presented in public in their annual event 2 weeks ago is to reach at least 95% of their members and make mandatory to report as part of the membership requirement on their policies and their lending and investment practices. Therefore, we are going to see in very practical terms the investment community kicking in big time. So I'll say, wrapping up, the good news is the conversation around business and human rights is becoming normal at the high end, at certain level, large companies, large investors, enlightened governments, and so that is happening. Due diligence is out of the question, is already embedded by the OECD and embedded by ILO. So we have a common entry point. Due diligence is the way to go.
Due diligence is linked very clearly to good governance and good corporate governance, including transparency and accountability, where the GRI kicks in very, very clearly. And we don't have right now pushback for this agenda among any of the stakeholders. So where we are right now is that we are at a pioneer level. We have solid foundations. Is that what we're saying? 10 years of building the foundations for our next decade to come, that we want to raise the ambition into the next decade, connecting very clearly to the SDGs towards 2030 or climate change towards 2050, but raising the ambition based on solid foundations. And we're building momentum towards June 2021, when we will celebrate the first 10 years, in order to launch this renewed ambition into the next decade. And we feel confident that we're building that right momentum with all our partners on board, with big announcements that have been already made and commitments made, including GRI, including PRI. And of course, ILO is launching actually next week a paper connecting business human rights and the guiding principles to ILO in all their frameworks. So that is actually right now happening, and it's all good news. On the same side, on the same hand, let's say, I will say, we're moving from pioneers where we are right now with positive prospects into the future, and we need to stress implementation and its effectiveness. And of course, is to be seen. I cannot foresee the future, but at least we're getting all the planets in right alignment. And the sadness of COVID-19, of course, a lot of misery and a lot of people dead and a lot of economic costs. The flip side of it is that we are recognizing that we need to build back better, and we need more than building back. We need a future that is better based on the lessons learned from the present, many of them very bad lessons, that where we need better governance and where we need to rediscover the value of collaboration if we want to address root causes, and if we want to address pressing challenges of the present that remain into the future, inequality or climate change, just to mention some of them. So that will be my intervention right now, Leila, and thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Dante, for sharing the good news and hope and optimism as we're moving towards this, advancing this agenda towards the next decade and the next years, I would say. So we have Dr. Amanda Romero joining us now. Amanda, please, we look forward to your comments, your insights, particularly on the state of human rights, in the region, and how is this balance working between the relationship between business and society?
Thank you very much for this kind invitation, and I will share my screen with you. So first of all, to tell you about my organization, I work as the regional representative for South America, and I'm working for now 9 years now with the center. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center works as the largest global platform on business and human rights. It's now in 10 languages, and we cover over 10,000 different companies in our website. We work around 3 main targets. First one is transparency. We track the human rights conduct of these more than 10,000 companies worldwide. We also try to seek for accountability and invite companies through our informal mechanism to respond to public allegations made by civil society organizations with a response rate of 75%. And also we work for the empowerment of local communities, NGOs, and even companies and governments with tools that they need to increase their leverage with businesses. At the moment, we are tracking information from different regions of the world. We are 18 regional representatives covering this information. So regarding the question of what we do, we are focusing also in one of the main problems we are facing today globally and in Latin America, and it is the human rights defenders. So we have tried to redefine or to take the definitions by the UN Human Rights Council and the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, that it is someone, a alone or with others that act to promote or protect human rights, individuals, organizations, and communities who are peacefully working to uphold and advance rights and define but what they do, not who they are. And also we are focusing on land right defenders, community leaders, human rights organizations, trade unionists, and other labor rights defenders like lawyers, journalists, artists, etc. In this regard, we are facing a lot of issues regarding the attacks against human rights defenders that come mostly from mining sector globally and also in Latin America, agribusiness. We also have here the renewable energy sector and the oil, gas, and coal sectors. And in Latin America, we have the highest number of attacks so far, according to our database on this information. We also are concerned about the situation of women human rights defenders. So we are trying to see that the situation of women has increased the levels of attacks because they are more activists than perhaps some other male members in their communities. So we have to face this, and we think it is important to materialize what Dante was saying, how to implement the UN guiding principles facing or regarding this situation. We have been tracking that one of the main areas of concern has to do with land rights, and also the lawsuits and regulatory action against human rights defenders that have been arrested or arbitrarily arrested and trialed. So we are trying to see how to implement pillar number 1 with regard to protection that the states should implement. Number 2, how companies may improve this situation. So we say, and we are recommended that, of course, companies should embed responsible business conduct into policies and management systems. There are good examples in Latin America, but still a lot of public relations language and a lot of social activities that do not respond directly to the policies to address human rights defenders' risks and other human rights issues related to company operations. So we attach to the definition of what is a company operation or a company context based on John Ruggie's developments and the UN Working Group developments and reports. We think it's important that companies identify the risks that defenders have, and that the company should assess the adverse impacts of their operations. We think it's important to remark here that, of course, companies support and have different approaches and support development issues, but at the same time, certain types of extractive companies, for instance, of certain activities, services, and products by companies may also impact negatively on human rights, and companies should recognize that, and at the same time of acknowledging them, refer to their value chains and business relationships. Also, that they can seize, prevent, or mitigate adverse impacts on defenders, tailoring the response to the circumstances and defenders' needs, particularly those who belong to indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, poor rural dwellers or inhabitants, and also women and children. In this way, I think we need to have a better coordination between the impacts caused by companies and pillar number 3 regarding how to implement measures and resources beyond those of voluntary frameworks, and also those that only rely on mechanisms of complaints that many companies are putting in place. At the same time, when they have these policies embedded, they should track the implementation and results and have a public disclose whether their business is not connected to these risks to defenders and how they manage these risks. So we also attach here, and we use the definition by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights when it refers to the OECD guidelines that say that companies should go beyond the internal risks they have identified in their operations, and look at the external impacts that they have. And finally, that they should establish an operational level grievance mechanisms, but these grievance mechanisms should also have a conversation and who have also a commitment with the international human rights legislation and the national laws that protect human rights defenders. That's what I wanted to share in the first place with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Romero, for bringing the conversation to the center, no? Which is what happens between this relationship between business and society. And at the very beginning, we were reflecting now that this relationship is human-centered, no? And you are bringing the human impacts, no? So we talk in UNGP language, we talk about human rights due diligence, as a means, no, to identify where are the risks, no, of the potential impacts and salient risks in human life and the environment. So let's move on to Dr. Olga Orozco. We already been listening a lot about the role of the state, Pillar 1, no, what's happening in this front, and we look forward to learning from all that you have to say.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and you forgot to say something that is very important to me, and that is that I am a very proud Hoya parent. So yes, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Okay, so let me say a few words about the ILO. I hope that everybody is more or less familiar with what we do. But just to remind you, we are the oldest UN agency. We had our 100th anniversary last year. And our job is to look for decent work for everybody. And we do that through a mechanism that is the production of conventions and recommendations. And those conventions and recommendations are accorded or agreed in a tripartite manner. What that means is that we put together governments, unions, and employers' organizations, and together they decide what the convention or what the rules that they want to implement are. In a second step, the countries need to ratify those conventions and implement. So that's more or less what we do on a regular basis. Of course, business and human rights is at the center of the decent work agenda. And now with COVID more than ever. In the last year, since the pandemic started, we have been following very closely what is happening in the region regarding employment and decent work. And the numbers that we have are very sad and discouraging. We know, for example, that in the second quarter of this year in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, we lost 80 million jobs, and another 60 million jobs were lost in the third quarter. And the numbers show that the region will remain one of the most affected economically in the world. So we are heading for very tough times in the next months and years to come. And it's not only the loss of employment, it's also how the loss of employment has impacted specific groups like women, like migrant workers that we have many in the region, like young people. So it's really difficult situation for our workers. And just not to forget that we came before pandemic from already difficult circumstances. Think about this. If you're in Peru, 3 out of 4 workers work in informality. That means that they don't have a contract. That means that they don't have a pension. That means that they don't have probably health and safety or any kind of insurance. So now this is all exacerbated by the new conditions that the pandemic brings. Those are the informal workers. Now let's focus on those who work for a formal business enterprise. It's been tough there too. It's not only because many companies had closed and had economic difficulties, but also because of the threat of the sanitary risks. And finally, let's talk for a minute about those who are the most lucky of everybody, who is those who can work from home. And we all have the experience, I'm sure, that conciliating the personal care responsibilities, the caring for children, for elder people, for sick people, and trying to work at the same time, telework, the stress, all this has to take a toll on workers around the region and around the world. One more observation that is maybe not very evident, but it's also a reality. Domestic violence had increased very highly in the last months. And this is all because of the confinement. So this is the situation that we have. And what we from ILO do, trying to, let's say, mitigate these kind of situations, is we encourage governments, employers, and workers' associations to play a role in what is coming in designing and implementing the responses, not only in the short term, but in the long term. We believe that we need long-term policy responses. And those long-term policy responses have to be based on human rights. They have to consider gender issues. They have to consider the protection of the environment. And we really need to be seeking all together to foster sustainable enterprises. Okay, now, Dante already mentioned what we do at the Responsible Business Conduct Project. This is a project financed by the European Commission, by the EU. And one of the things that we try to do there, among others, is to promote that countries either draft or implement what we call a national action plan for business and human rights. These action plans are the way governments make tangible application of the principles of the United Nations, of the guiding principles. So in some countries in the region, we already have those, like Colombia and Chile. In other countries, we are supporting that they are writing a business plan, a national action plan, like in Peru. Ecuador just announced last month that they want to have a national action plan for business and human rights. So we see this as our job to support the governments in realizing that plan, but also ensuring that workers and employers are participants, very active participants on what is decided there. And I want to spare a couple of minutes on the topic of why the EU is so interested in, for example, paying for a project like the one that we work on to promote business and human rights in Latin America. So the first thing that I want to mention is that the EU has from the policy perspective, from the trade policy perspective, this is very important. From the trade policy perspective, they have this commitment to the promotion of human rights. They have the commitment to a strategic policy that they call trade for all. And all is underlined because the way they see it is not sufficient that they protect the workers in Europe. They also want to ensure that the consumers in Europe receive some kind of warranty that the production of their bananas and their computers and their clothes were not done under conditions that they consider deplorable. And at the same time, they want to support the SMEs or the business in Colombia, in Peru, in Costa Rica, that are working with them as trade partners. So this is very important. And I have seen a very dramatic change in how business themselves, they see this topic. Let me tell you a little story. Leila mentioned that I used to work for the BSCI, the Business Social Compliance Initiative. This is a platform of enterprises. And 10, 15 years ago, part of our job was to lobby the European Commission to tell them voluntary initiatives should remain voluntary. And due diligence is important, but it should be voluntary. This was our job. We did a lot of efforts to implement due diligence across supply chains in Asia and Latin America, very good job. But at the same time, I'm telling you, the line of work was, this must be voluntary. Well, last September, 2 months ago, I saw the news. So AMFORI, which is the Business Social Compliance Initiative, and other 20 very big companies, so altogether more than almost 2,500 European companies, sent a letter to the Commission, and they tell the Commission, okay, we agree that you have to play a role on this. And we see that we need a level playing field, and the way to do that is to make due diligence mandatory. we want that you set the rules. Of course, they continue to say voluntary initiatives are very important. We need to support them. The environment has to be right. But now they recognize that they need that there is a level playing field and that they don't want to leave anyone behind, because it's also in their own interest that everybody is doing this kind of efforts. So my message, to cut it short here and hoping that I get a little bit more time at the end, is the following. There is a lot of deficit in decent work in the region. There is a lot of work to do. The second is governments really need to step up and start providing platforms and policies that really push businesses forward to do these kind of actions. Dante recognized it, and I think very, very, very clear manner, that we have in Latin America a very clear increase in the activity of due diligence through our partners, through our commercial partners in the EU, in the US sometimes. But the reality is that only 3%, more or less 3% of the workers are covered with those activities. The rest, 97%, they are not covered by these kind of activities. We need to step up the due diligence in the region. And finally, just to say that the pressure from our commercial partners is a positive pressure, and we need to step up that at the local level. We need the local businesses to put themselves at the same level, and that it is not so different if I am producing a banana that is going to be eaten in Germany or a banana that is going to be eaten in Bogota, the conditions for those workers should be the same. So that is my message. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Olga, because you are bringing very important elements into this discussion as well, enriching it. What is the role of the state, the governments in integrating and cohesive and harmonized policies, no, as part of these national action plans that, by the way, are also should be also be integrating the power and the leverage of trade agreements. No, how from the EU you are mentioning, no, there is this movement, this regulation, directives. Probably next year we're going to have a new directive, no, on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. Is being discussed right now. There is an open consultation. So how is that blending in, no, at the national levels, and how do we step up the role of governments through regulation, and how does the private sector integrate these practices through due diligence, human rights due diligence? And speaking of that, I'm pleased to welcome José Augusto Palma, who will speak from an association perspective, the private sector. Please, José.
Thank you, Lelia. Good morning to everyone. And thank you again for the invitation to CAROLA, to Lelia. I'm very pleased to be here, as you pointed out. And, I am a LLM graduate from the Georgetown Law School. So anytime I can contribute back a little bit, I'm very pleased to do so, and I welcome the opportunity. Just as an introduction, a little bit about the association. As Lelia pointed out, I represent Peru's Mining, Oil, and Energy Association. It's an institution that has been around since 1896. We represent more than 150 companies from those three industries, as well as, very importantly, the principal suppliers to both the mining, energy, and oil industries. We play an active role in public policy debates, both with the executive branch and with Congress and with civil society in general, promoting best practices, including sustainability and human rights. We view ourselves as a catalyst for knowledge sharing. We try to draw upon the knowledge, experiences, from abroad, from institutions such as the ILO, OECD, UNDP, and try to bring them back to Peru, sharing with our members and with the broader business sector. In my case, as Lelia pointed out, I chair the mining chapter within the organization. So I'm here representing the pillar of business enterprises, specifically the mining sector. And to give a little context as to, about the whole issue, for us, as an association and for member companies, we are fully committed with the guiding principles on business and human rights. And we've been participating since very early on in the process, either through our member companies or directly in the UN's work in this field. Some of our member companies, in fact, participated in 2006 in the broad consultations led by John Ruggie, which led to, as we all know, to the current guiding principles. And we continue to be involved and active in the implementation and the furtherance of the UN's framework to protect, respect, and remedy in the area of human rights. But I also want to point out that while the guiding principles are great and we are fully committed to them, our companies have respected human rights long before they were in place. We have a long-standing history of respecting internationally recognized human rights, including those embedded in the ILO Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights of Work. We fully recognize the freedom of association, the freedom of collective bargaining. We're completely opposed to forced or compulsory labor, and always supportive of any action that has to do with the abolition of child labor and the elimination of all types of discrimination. And another thing that is critical to us and is embedded in our culture as corporate culture is risk management and identification of risks. That's part of our DNA of all of our member companies. And I think that's what has in the past allowed the companies in the extractive industries in general to have world-class standards in many areas. For example, in the area of safety and occupational health. It is precisely, these standards and this history of having these protocols that have allowed us in this time now of COVID to quickly adopt protocols that have allowed us to protect our workers and the environments around our operations. And so we have, at least the mining companies in Peru and the extractive industries in general, have adopted protocols that far exceed the requirements established by the government. And that has allowed us to resume operations after three months, in the case of Peru, of total shutdown in the mining sector. But at the same time, protecting the health of our workers, our suppliers, and the communities that are around our operations. We believe the guiding principles are a very useful tool to advance and to the human rights cause and prevent potential impacts on human rights directly or indirectly. And we have incorporated the due diligence human rights both as an institution and then with our member companies as part of our risk management framework. And so a little bit about the institution and what it has done. We created a working group on human rights many years ago within the association. In 2008, we incorporated to our code of conduct a specific principle on human rights. We already had at that time many other principles included of human rights already included in the code of conduct, such as respect of the environment, respect for cultural diversity, and the elimination of non-discrimination. But in 2008, we expressly stated that our members were required to conduct activities respecting and promoting human rights. So that has been in place since 2008. Last year, we took that further and we adopted a model human rights policy, which provides a framework for all of our members, to the extent they haven't already adopted specific human rights policies, to also take that step and include a specific human rights policy. This is particularly important for our suppliers. Many of the mining companies and oil companies, again, these are very large multinationals, publicly traded companies that have long, had these policies in place. Anglo American, Newmont, even Hochschild Mining. But now that it's time for us to take this to the next level. Work with the smaller companies and work with our suppliers. So this model human rights policy has been in place, and it's lays kind of like the framework for us to continue our work in this process. Now, the working group on human rights of the association is also tasked with promoting the guiding principles And we do that in collaboration with organizations such as the ILO. This year alone, we've had 8 seminars in Peru, specifically focused on human rights due diligence to really build capacity within our organization, within our member organizations, and awareness raising in this critical area, not just in the mining sector and the oil and energy, but also, like I said, throughout the business sector of the country. We're also very actively engaged in the 2030 agenda and promoting and furthering the SDGs. We regularly work with our companies. We have a portal on our website. You can look at it. It's the community. It's called the Community, where we highlight the key initiatives and projects undertaken by our member companies to further the SDGs in Peru. And another area that we're quite involved is in multi-stakeholder initiatives on human rights. We have been involved with the OECD, working with them regarding responsible business conduct and human rights, as well as this guiding due diligence in this area. And we've also been very involved in the National Action Plan on Business Enterprises and Human Rights that is currently being held in Peru, where Olga and Dante have also had important roles in accompanying the process. On the voluntary principle side, we've also been quite active for a long time, since 2010, in fact, when Yanacocha, Newmont, and Socios Peru, the Peruvian branch of Partners for Democratic Change, established a working group on voluntary principles. We continue to be involved as part of the steering committee in that front and continue to work with other stakeholders to try to advance voluntary principles in the sector. So, and finally, and I won't take much longer, the association last year also established a specific group on diversity and inclusion to address gender. And we believe, this is an area that represents a great opportunity for the sector to contribute and to really make its mark and a lasting contribution. So for now, I'll leave it here, and I'll pass it on back to you, Lydia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, José Augusto, and thank you also for mentioning my former colleagues at Socios Peru and Partners for Democratic Change, where we worked for over 10 years on the voluntary principles on security and human rights, and making the transition from policies to action and implementation. What you're also speaking is something that reminds me of a recent report earlier this year that came out of the World Economic Forum that talks about dynamic materiality, using again UNGP language. What are the material impacts of private sector activity on human life and the environment? And I can see the progression and how it has evolved in Peru with the private sector and the mining, petroleum, and energy companies. So it's very rewarding to see that. And also it's a reminder, this concept of dynamic materiality, it's never ending. So we always have to look at how is context changing. And that is a challenge at all levels. But, again, as we are moving into these more compliance requirements on not risk management and human rights due diligence as well. So those are conversations that we're having. We're beginning to receive questions, but we'll move towards Andrea, and then I will bring some of the questions. I'm very pleased to bring Andrea into this conversation. Number one, because it's been 5 years since we last saw each other having breakfast in Bogota, discussing these issues, Andrea. I was wrapping up a project on business and human rights with the voluntary principles also in Colombia. And we were having very interesting discussions on the role of lawyers in promoting business and human rights as well. And the second thing that I'm very pleased to share here with the audience is that Andrea has been recently named as one of the most successful managers of Colombia. So congratulations to you, Andrea, and all to your leadership and your great work. So please do take it away and tell us everything that you are doing from GRI.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be back at Georgetown, even if virtually. Reflecting back on our breakfast, I can only think how much things have changed over the last 5 years. And if I keep reflecting to my years back at Georgetown, you have no idea how difficult it was to find classes that would address the issues we are discussing today. I would often just go with those professors that would at least have one session in this. And I do recall a very well-known professor at the main campus that told me, I understand this is your passion, but I just don't see it in the business context. So I hope his sessions have changed because the world certainly is changing. At the Global Reporting Initiative, we do hope to change corporate behavior around sustainable development and in particular human rights. And that's not a simple task. You know, change is a process, and I think it has many factors that play into that. Our contribution comes from the transparency and measurement approach. And you did mention materiality, which I will address in a little bit. But we believe that what gets measured gets managed, and that's why we deliver what's known as the GRI standards, the world's most widely adopted sustainability reporting framework, which is a free public good. And at the moment, 75% of the largest 250 companies in the world use GRI to report. And close to 2,000 SMEs in Latin America do so as well. 70 governments around the world either required or reference GRI in their public policies, as well as over 30 stock exchanges. We exist, and our purpose is to help organizations be transparent and be accountable for their impacts, because we do believe that's the way in which we will create a better future. Now, I often get the question, do I manage first and report later? In our view, measuring and reporting are part of managing, and reporting cannot just be done once I have achieved the level of results I was hoping for. There is much more to the equation of reporting than just looking good in a report and adding pictures of feel-good activities. And I think this potential that comes with reporting has been recognized by the guiding principles when they say states should encourage and where appropriate require business enterprises to communicate how they address their human rights impacts. However, and in particular in Latin America, a state role is not necessary to make disclosure a requirement for a business enterprise. Guiding Principle 21 also provides that in order to account for how they address their human rights impacts, business enterprises should be prepared to communicate this externally, particularly when concerns are raised by or on behalf of affected stakeholders. Reporting is also part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and it has its own target under 12.6. And why is that? Because it can actually help companies become more aware of and understand the human rights impacts of their decisions and activities. Our standards light on the foundation that an organization must identify material issues to report on. And what you're going to find the more you get into the whole discussion and standards is that where we deviate from each other is in what we consider to be material. What are those key issues, that key information that stakeholders need to make better decisions about a company? In our standards, we say that in order to define that list, which is critical, an organization must engage with the stakeholders, and the report needs to be a balance from what the company wants to say and what stakeholders need to know. And they need to include their view. This was, as Dante mentioned it, very new to Latin America, the idea that you talk to others and do stakeholder engagement to define the content of the report. On top of that, you also have to account for impact based on its operations and must take a look at the broader sustainability context in which a company operates. And as a result, many of the topics that come as material that end up being material are linked to business and human rights. At the moment, and I said at the moment because we're updating our standards, we defined impact as the effect an organization has on the economy, the environment, and/or the society, which in turn can indicate its contribution, positive or negative, to sustainable development. We're proposing that companies look at external impact. We're not referring to an effect that an external element of the context may have on the performance or reputation of the organization. And why is that? Because both individuals and companies are much better at looking how the world impacts them than looking how we impact the world. So at the end, the responsibility is with the reporting organization in terms of defining what are material topics. And one of the things we have seen, we have been around for 22 years. We're the oldest standard when it comes to sustainability reporting, is that in many cases, business and human rights was not coming up. We don't understand necessarily why, as a material topic in industries or contexts where we knew it was a material topic. So we're currently working with support from Dante and other colleagues to update the human rights related GRI standards and the universal standards to better align with those instruments of the UN guiding principles, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, just as part of updating the standards. We always do that to make sure they reflect the current practices that are important at the moment. And what we're doing is we're including a new set of human rights specific disclosures. We are changing or updating the definition of impact and the definition of stakeholder. We are reviewing and revising the range of human rights related topics covered in the GRI standards. And we're sure this is going to have a major impact in the way companies approach both the context and also their impacts when it comes to sustainability reporting and human rights in particular. I want to make sure that we have time to discuss, so I don't want to just go over time, but I do want to highlight that at the moment, companies are facing external pressure for a lot of stakeholders to keep reporting. I often say this is like a round table where the company was already at that table. Some of the stakeholders were at the table for longer even than the company. You have civil society there, international organizations, you have academia there, you have workers there. But we have a new actor that's come to the table. And it was mentioned by a couple of my fellow panelists. The investors have now come to the table. I think for 10 years or even more, we've been saying when we argue that there is a business case to corporate sustainability, that they were at the table. But in reality, they are just coming to the table, in particular in Latin America. However, a good part of the discussion with investors is centered still around environmental impacts. They are a lot more comfortable with the numbers that come with environmental data and less comfortable with discussing social issues and business and human rights. There are some recent developments that are promising, but I do think it's still a new topic for investors. COVID-19 is pushing us all to look at the social side again and in a way rebalance this small s to a large S on the social side again, and I think that's very promising. You do find a set of committed institutional investors that have taken the lead about this, but I think my fellow panelists and perhaps other participants would agree that many of them have a long way to go in terms of human rights due diligence and demanding the right type of data when it comes to human rights performance. We believe that in order for being able to enable better decision making, you do need data, and data needs to be standardized. So I'll just leave it there. Hopefully we'll get to discuss more.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for raising all these issues and putting them on the table. It's very important, no? It's like the role of GRI is in integrating all these standards. There are so many standards, no? During my last class during the summer on business and human rights, we were discussing this with my students and with the group of faith-based investors here in the US that I have been engaging with, Mercy Investments, the Jewish Lens Network, and Asset Management, representing the Christian faith, the Jewish tradition, and the Muslim tradition. And we were all discussing these issues. How do we move, from standards also and integrate that in corporate governance and managing the salient and material issues of the corporate activity. And not only on the environment, it's interesting to see that there is a growing interest and commitment to bring the human rights and social dimensions of this dynamic materiality process. We are beginning to receive lots of questions, and I want to make sure that we're honoring them because there's a lot of interest in the audience. I'm gonna share the first two that come from Elizabeth Echeverria Manrique. She wants to know what are examples of operational level grievance mechanisms and how effective are they in providing remedy? And Amanda mentioned this. I think it would be also very interesting to hear from all of you, but I am putting you, Amanda, on the spot. She's also wants to know, Elizabeth also wants to know how all panelists do see the initiatives that are being discussed, whether they are effective in dealing with decent work deficits exacerbated by structural issues. She's mentioning pricing issues, buyers squeezing of prices, but overall is decent work conditions, that Olga was mentioning. And there's another question for Olga around this that I will bring in also, but for everyone, no? So one participant wants to know whether the EU initiative is available to consult on the website or other EU initiatives as well. We can put those links on the chat and make them available. So maybe we can start with Amanda addressing this first round of questions, and I move to the rest of the speakers. Amanda.
Thank you very much, Lelia. Actually, when we speak about grievance mechanism, we have to bear in mind that the central of the remedy pillar should be in the access to justice, to formal judicial mechanisms by victims, which are in Latin America very weak and very lengthy, and we do not have access really to law firms and human rights organizations with abilities also to deal with big companies. So that is one main obstacles we have identified. Secondly, the United Nations has Office on the High Commissioner has developed some studies about non-state or non-judicial remedy mechanisms that are really very helpful in the case of the ombudspersons in Latin America and different ways of dealing with these conflicts between companies and communities. And lastly, the grievance mechanisms are not as effective as we should like because they rely on voluntary processes internally in different companies. And as our colleague here in the panel has mentioned, many companies have written their policies and have embedded human rights in writing, but not in practice so far in many regards about how to have a conversation between a private grievance mechanism and the formal access to justice for victims. So there is a gap between these two elements or two roads that we can find accessing remedy and solving a lot of problems we have between individuals, being workers, women, or communities. I leave it like that.
Thank you very much, Amanda, because you are talking about this tension. It's a good tension to have, we should say, no, on under Pillar 3, no, access to remedy, no, because it's a role for the private sector to open the space for those grievances to come through. But at the same time, we cannot overlook the important role of the state, of the government, no, making sure that the formal mechanisms that you are talking about are properly function, efficient, and existent for citizens, no? And I will move now into Olga and then to the rest of our speakers to go on the conversation.
Can you allow me to say a word on access to remedy?
Yes, please, Dante, please.
I just want to complement what Amanda was saying, because from the Office of the High Commissioner, there were 3 reports. One on state-based judicial access to remedy, state-based non-judicial access to remedy, and operational grievance mechanisms. So it's basically at the company level.
And the three of them gives us more or less the same picture. We have the infrastructure in place, but it's not working right for the victims, for the people affected. So the effectiveness is the problem of the implementation, not the lack of possibilities. So what we're pushing is the use of the three options. And what we identify is, and the guiding principles have principle 31, which is about how to evaluate or measure the effectiveness. And the effectiveness of the implementation, the effectiveness in function of the ones that are affected negatively, and those are the ones that have to put a note, a grade, or have to judge how effective it is in function of its effectiveness. So if I suffer negative consequences, what is my practical experience? Option 1, option 2, option 3, a mix of them. But at the end of the day, that's where we, let's say, where the rubber hits the road in terms of government, let's say, the duty of governments to protect and the responsibility of business to respect are measured in function of what happens in reality when things go wrong. When things go wrong, and it's normal to have things going wrong because we're humans, therefore we are imperfect by definition. When things go wrong, what happened in reality? And that's the end game in terms of how to evaluate how well or bad we're doing. And the second point is a mindset change, because grievances are very often considered to be, let's say, when harm already happened, you have victims. But grievances at the core is about prevention, is early alerts, is the possibility to identify harm when it's on small scale before it becomes something of big magnitude. And most part of the grievance mechanisms don't understand that it's actually in business interest to have strong grievance mechanism because it's early alert. And when you understand it from that logic and perspective to as part of a preventative approach regarding negative impacts, then it makes more sense, it's more digestible somehow, and it becomes something really, really useful. So companies tend to be good, let's say consumers, good companies, good in listening to their consumers, their clients, because you're customer oriented. So most companies do have the technology and the capacity to listen when something is starting to go wrong, and before it becomes a scandal, let's say a PR scandal. The same rationale, the same logic can be applicable to any kind of impact. And therefore, I will say the capacity exists even in-house, but it has not been put in function of a preventative approach regarding harm and that could happen and can be prevented. So that's what I wanted just to complement.
No, it's fantastic, Dante. Thank you so much for adding this very important piece of reflection. I always reflect on the importance of understanding that, of course, from a business perspective, we work on transactions, at all levels. It's compliance. And yet, when our work or the business perspective, the work will have impacts outside, and that involves engaging with different stakeholders. We are moving from only transactional exercises to more relational exercises as well. So that is a dance that from a business perspective, it's important to integrate and all these standards. Olga, please.
Thank you. I agree with many of the comments already made regarding effectiveness of grievance mechanism. I want to add one point on that, and that is, let's not forget that probably the most effective way to prevent violations and to prevent damages and to contain risk is through labor unions. The role of labor unions at companies are precisely to represent the workers and to avoid that these damages have to happen. So we have to go to a claim or a complaint or a grievance. So let's relevate how important it is the presence of unions and the representation for workers and all this process. And just give me one more minute to to mention something on the effectiveness of the processes for due diligence in general. There are books written about this. You can find many papers written about how effective or not effective social audits are, or certifications or standards and the visits from auditors, how effective that is. And let's not go into that, but let's think from the other side. If I am a labor inspector, or if I am an NGO trying to find problems in companies, and I have to choose between one company that has a code of conduct and it has a commitment towards the guiding principles, and it has a committee that deals with those issues, and I have another company on the side that has none of these elements, that tells me that there is less awareness. And even though the company that is committed may not be perfect, I certainly will say that there is a lot more to be done on those companies that have not done the commitment, the assessments, the risk assessments. So let's keep on in balance the fact that what we need is that more companies make the commitments, and there is more awareness among companies and among clients and among consumers, so we can raise the level for everybody. That will be my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga. José Augusto, and if I may add, there's another question for you specifically that is asking for what types of processes and or technologies are the member companies of the association using for stakeholder engagement, communities and workers? And are they anonymous for stakeholders to answer and send grievances?
Thank you, Lilia, for the question. I guess first talking about the grievance mechanisms. I mean, I fully agree with Dante. It's an early alert. It's part of good management, and it's part of listening to your stakeholders. And more than 80% of the member companies in the association have already in place grievance mechanisms and are routinely used as part of their everyday job. Now, the association itself is also, we have a model grievance mechanism, which we're updating. This is a project that we have, hopefully will be finished in the first trimester before I leave. We're going to update it to incorporate many of the principles, behind the UN guiding principles, particularly focused on gender. We're going to be interculturality. I think that's a word, and other principles such as access, dialogue, transparency, etc. We want to modernize it, and we want to engage with our members again to go through this process to ensure that the grievance mechanisms that they have in place are fully compliant or aligned with the guiding principles. Just a quick note before I talk about technology on access to remedy that was also addressed. And this is an anecdote, I guess, or part of what we did this year. And it has to do with conflicts. I mean, we believe that the reduction of, first of all, reduction of inequality is a moral prerogative, and it's something that we need to work on because it leads to conflicts, and conflicts lead to the reduction of it's an obstacle to private investment and economic development, which in turn doesn't allow us to bring decent work to people. So how do we reduce conflicts, which is a key issue in Peru? And there, the first thing I want to mention is that you need to understand, before attacking the issue of conflicts, you need to understand the origin of conflicts. And the National Ombudsman in Peru has been very clear to state that more than 80% of conflicts in Peru originate from the failure of the state to meet its basic obligations to provide access to human rights, or to abide by the commitments that it has made in the past. Now, for us as a sector, we're not interested in pointing fingers. We're interested in moving forward. Okay, and so in that regard, last year, when the government created a high-level commission, independent commission to propose amendments to the mining legal framework, we, as an association, made a proposal. And our proposal was, a blueprint for a multi-stakeholder process to craft a comprehensive development plans for the territories where the mining or other projects occurred. As part of that, we also proposed a non-judicial mechanisms to resolve grievances, because we think it's absolutely necessary, to have access to remedy and a grievance mechanism, whether it's in remedy. Unfortunately, the commission did not include our proposal in their final report, but that doesn't discourage us. We're going to continue to work to ensure, that it's given a fair chance and that it's considered again, because we believe that it's consistent with the guiding principles and it deserves further consideration. Now, in terms of technology, yes, we use. I can speak for members, and I can speak specifically as to offshore mining. We use technology as part of, to address grievance mechanisms. We have an internal grievance mechanism. We have a whistleblowing system in place, which is completely anonymous, is technology driven. But that's internally. Externally, we also have a grievance mechanism in place where we also use technology. We do both. You can go to our offices and record your grievance, or you can use our technological platform to do so. In both instances, we have KPIs that allow us to track when we receive these and to get back to whoever has made the grievance within a certain time frame with response, and that's a response sometimes leads to further dialogue and with the engaged party.
Thank you so much, José Augusto, and for talking also about KPIs, key performance indicators, how relevant they are, as Andrea was mentioning. Andrea.
Thank you. Since we're close to being out of time, just going back to my previous job being the head of the national contact point, there's one element that's not written, but to me is crucial, it's trust. Trust in those non-judicial mechanisms, at least in Latin America, I find it to be quite complex. It's like an imbalanced round table again, where the company is a lot more powerful and comes to the table, in the case of the NCP with mediation, comes to the table better equipped, usually represented by the lawyers. We're not good at that. And then you have the affected communities or the affected stakeholders with a level of distrust that's really hard to break. So I think being able to build trust is the foundation for that non-judicial mechanism to really work. We're a very legalistic culture run by lawyers, So I do think there is a lot of potential in those type of mechanisms, especially for healing, based on my experience. Having said that, I always recommend companies do not send a lawyer. Send someone else to this table, because we have a lot more to discuss. I also wanted to tackle one of the questions on COVID-19. I do think the SDG8 discussion, one of my students explained this beautifully. He's an undergrad. He said, this is the SDG for companies because they already create jobs. They just need to make them decent. And I think that really says a lot about this SDG, what decency means, and what COVID-19 has really, according to UNDP, Latin America went back 15 years in poverty reduction. What that creates is a risk. Everyone will be asking for jobs and they will take whatever it means. So I think companies have a fantastic opportunity to really make a difference when it comes to how that job creation will take place. And I do believe many of them are doing a fantastic job when it comes to that. Having said that, they're presented with challenges that were unknown to them. One of them, working from home, and what decency means when it comes to working from home. We did a recent panel last week on mental health as a condition for decent jobs, and what it means to actually respect lunchtime, respect the schedules, as a different and new angle that comes with the COVID-19 challenges. So I do think all of those efforts do need to be measured so that you can actually take the narrative and turn that into results that would allow to build trust with external stakeholders, but also it will help you as a company manage better and understand whether what you're trying to do is working or not. And without data, that's impossible to do. So I was just leaving there.
Dante, yes.
One minute as a wrap-up comment, because I think there are lots of conversations that we can have around corporate
Yes.
governance. What does it mean? The role of leadership, the enabling environment that is required by government. So there are many angles, but there's one that I want to add, which is evidence. We need to allow evidence to speak by itself. And the evidence, sadly, is not reflecting the good intentions of governments and overall business, except exceptional cases. So we have weak evidence that shows that the good intentions are being translated into reality and on scale. And so I just want to point out that as we're building the infrastructure in Latin America to monitor, to facilitate peer learning, to push a race to the top, this is central. What is the evidence telling us? And it will be a call for governments and for business to put focus there, demonstrate in a credible manner that you're actually making progress, and don't pretend to be perfect, because that's not credible, that's not possible even, but at least show that you're moving in the right direction. And on that regard, who's missing in this conversation and is the elephant in the room almost all the time are our governments. Our governments are not really doing their part properly, and they shy off very, very often. So we need better governance. We need an enabling environment. We need our governments on the table. Actually, I report to governments. It's an intergovernmental body, and it's so hard to get them on board and to commit for the very basic things that are obligations. So if you have an obligation, how can it be hard to have a conversation about implementing obligations? Well, reality is that it is hard, and that's the elephant in the room regarding this agenda big time.
Yes, thank you so much, Dante, and by the way, we did invite the elephant in the room, but unfortunately we couldn't get some representatives to join us due to scheduling conditions, but this is very important. And we're past the hour, but there's a very great question also. In one second, each one of you, what would be your wish list that should be included in this big upcoming European Union directive, some people are saying, on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, and how is that going to leverage the discussion with governments and private sector at the national level? Amanda.
Very quickly, yes, we are monitoring very closely these developments. We are and we are encouraging that companies and the European Union also commits to a global initiative under the binding treaty that has been discussed in the United Nations. We think that it is very far from reality at the moment, and therefore we rely on these developments in each countries, like the modern slavery acts in Australia or the UK, but also the French law, or also the discussions going on in Germany. Nevertheless, we don't see a contradiction between having a national legislation that would be mandatory due diligence for companies and governments, and at the same time having an international instrument like a binding treaty. So this is our wish, that we can really have this dialogue and this conversation moving forward, although we see the reluctance by many governments and many companies. Unfortunately, just to complement Dante's last words, unfortunately we have these revolving doors in which our members of government are at the same time CEOs of companies and know very confidential information about resources and about different procedures on how to enlarge the benefits for companies rather than protect their population. So this is something that we as a human rights organizations we are trying to move forward and to always recall when we have these type of conversations with companies, with the international intergovernmental bodies, and with other stakeholders.
Thank you. Olga?
Okay, my wish is the following. I hope that they include a lot of things on gender equality. The region has the condition that more women graduate from higher education than men, but still we have only 1/3 of managers in companies and only 4% of the CEOs in the region, in the companies in the region are women. We need infrastructure for childcare. This is almost null in the region. It's like having companies that don't have a parking lot where you can, so you cannot drive to work, or companies that are away from a bus station. We need infrastructure for childcare. We need support for the caring economy. And I hope that this is very seriously considered and pushed through this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. José Augusto?
I fully support Olga's wish. I'm 100% in agreement with her, and we are working as an association on that front, and also as Haksha. We have a very strong approach and objectives for gender, and we hope to meet them. But I also want to pick up where Dante left off, because I think it's an important comment. The absence of the government in this debate. I think it's critical that they step up. I think it's critical that they participate, and they do so in all of its facets. And I'm just briefly, in our experience, the National Action Plan, unfortunately, we're not seeing the government participate the way it should be. It's led by one institution as opposed to, all of the government being there present at the table, talking about business enterprises and how to work together and move forward collectively. This is about the way forward. This is not about the past for us. And how do we work together with civil society and with the governments to implement the guiding principles and to really drive and push forward the human rights agenda. And for us, last comment, which Olga and Amanda talked about, formalization is critical. I mean, this is something that for Peru, when 7 out of 70% of the population lives in informal situations where access to human rights is denied, it's unforgivable. And we need to work together with again, with civil society and with the government to correct that, because informality leads to violation of human rights. We've seen that particularly now with COVID, and we see it, in unfortunately also in Peru, in some activities that have really, they're outright illegal activities, such as illegal mining and illegal logging in the Amazon, which leads to violations of human rights and to violations of defenders of human rights. I mean, the cases that we have in Peru are, have to do with those two illicit activities in the Amazon. And we have been active in terms of working also with the government on a working group on defenders of human rights. We support that initiative. Many of our our member companies already have specific policies regarding that, and we're going to continue to work on that front. But informality is something that we really need to tackle as a country, and I think probably as a region.
Thank you so much, Andrea.
I could go on this. I'll just keep it to one, country by country reporting and evidence. M&Es, multinationals tend to conglomerate data and give us just one full picture, and those that are here, business and human rights, the impacts are local. So I do hope there is something in there that says that you'll have to report based on your impacts and report in the language where those impacts take place. That's my hope.
Thank you so much, Dante.
The working group issued recommendations to the European Commission regarding the mandatory human rights due diligence discussion. So I will stick to that set of recommendations and recommend you to take a look at them. But I want to highlight two. One is policy coherence. Human rights due diligence, not in isolation, but connected to labor rights and ILO, connected to climate change, connected to disclosure, connected to corporate governance, connected to public procurement, trade and commerce,
etc. So it's a whole set of policy measures that have to be interconnected and not in isolation. And the second point is that this process should include the participation of stakeholders up and down the value chain everywhere in the world, because the impact of this legislation and the reach of the legislation will reach us in the export-oriented economies and the ones that receive investments and from Europe. But so far, we have not really been part of the conversation. And we need civil society, unions, indigenous to participate in that discussion, also policymakers and business, because we're all of us are going to be impacted by positive legislative push, but we are not really engaging that much, and we are not really part of the equation that much, only on the margins. And that is something that we have raised to the European Commission, and especially I have raised that because I'm witnessing the risk that our business people and policymakers might feel that this is neo-colonialism or is non-commercial trade barriers, and it's a sort of, let's say, neo-protectionism behind this policy development that is really positive, and we look after it, but it has this potential risk or set of risks. So that will be the second element that I would like to highlight on the policy development in Europe.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your commitment and for staying past the hour. That tells us that there is a lot of excitement, there is a lot to talk about, and also we started with the question of what is a roadmap.
And it tells everyone that we're Latin Americans. So
yes, I was going to say that. I forgot.
We assume that could be the case. Yes. Yeah, so.
Indeed. And there's a lot of energy and commitment on what you said, Dante. How important it is to look for the evidence. No, we are talking about a roadmap. That roadmap has to be based on evidence to support all the regulatory work, the identification of potential policy alternatives that are inclusive and sustainable to advance this relationship between business and society in our region. There are lots of elements, lots of tools. There is a lot of excitement, and there's so much more to do. And this is a conversation that will continue between all of us. And I want to close with mentioning that our motto at the law school, at the Georgetown Law School, is that law is but the means, justice is the end. So the conversation we've had is very reflective of this motto that we use as to guide our work, looking for advancing access to remedy and justice for those communities and individuals that are impacted by the activities that we have been discussing. And I want to thank all of our panelists, because you are also embodying, in a way, another principle that is very important for us at Georgetown, which is that we are all women and men for others and with others, and you are giving back to society, to our community, by devoting and volunteering your time to share all your knowledge and expertise and your work. So thank you so much. And I want to close by thanking my colleague Cara Dabbs, Mario Osorio, and the entire IB team for making this possible. And with an invitation also to join us this Thursday at 11 a.m., where we're going to be discussing career paths on business and human rights law. So again, thank you so much. We will have the recording available for everyone on our website. Follow us on social media, and we will continue this conversation. Thank you so much again, everyone. Be well, be safe, be strong. Bye.
Thank you.